In the end, as we take our last breath, the only thing that'll matter to you are the people in that room with you and the time you spent with them. So prioritizing your time is super important. One of the interesting things about my journey is I achieved relative success at a super young age. And in that first season, I ruthlessly prioritized work. I would work 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. And I actually ended up getting sick quite often, flu and kind of like exhaustion where I'd hit a wall. And as I got older and I would get more titles, whether it was number one in my office, number one in the state, number one in the country, eventually number one in the company, I ended up having lots of trade-offs where I missed a lot of things that were important, like friends' weddings and bachelor parties and, people who I had a meaningful connection. And as I got older, I got married and had children. I wanted to make sure I didn't mess that up. One of the really cool things about my experience is I've gotten to sit in front of very successful men and women. And I've always asked them the same thing. What would you do differently? And 100% of the time, especially if someone's 50, 60, 70 in that latter season of their career in life, without hesitation, they said, don't miss the little things. Don't miss the little things. And now that I'm a father, I think through this a lot because my kids only want my time, right? It doesn't matter what kind of shoes they have or what trips they have, especially when they're really little. The real desire is for your attention. And so you have to remember that it is super important to not miss the little things. And it could be as structured as making sure that you schedule the entire year ahead of time for the big moments, right? Don't let a meaningful event, a graduation, a sporting game, a daddy-daughter dance, a meaningful milestone be interrupted by something that you could have planned correctly for, and make that the prioritization. Because in the end, when you're taking your last breath, no one's going to care about what title you had, what degree you had, what medals you had, what awards you have. At the end, as I've said goodbye to some dear family members, they just want familiar faces with years of relationship in front of them. The interesting part of the journey is I have learned and obsessed with not having regret. I truly believe regret in life is poison because it's an uncontrollable. And so if you think of time, there's only today. Tomorrow never actually exists, and the past is something you can't change. So I make a super conscious effort of not having regret, but having it be a lesson learned. So for me, I've never had something that I've clung to that I could not change, but I have had experiences with mentors and friends where I chose the career path or I did not prioritize the time. I recently lost a dear mentor of mine, but I did make an effort that anytime he called, I would call him back. Every time I was in town in the same city as him, I spent as much time with him because I knew the end was near. But I don't think we normally have the luxury of the diagnosis where somebody is told, hey, you're going to be here for 6 more months. And so you have this very finite clock ticking so you can prioritize. But I think if we think through how time works, so I'll give you an example. Jesse Itzler talks about the average age of the average male or female in this country. And then you think through if your parents don't live in the same town as you and the distance between the year they are and the average year or length of life. It could be 8 more years, 10 more years, 12 more years. And if you think through that you only get to see that person once or twice a year, and you frame that in a math problem where you have maybe 26 more times to see your parents, how different do you prioritize that missed call that we take for granted because we're busy? Or, do you go for a weekend or do you bring them here for a month or a week? And so I think it starts reframing everything when you kind of just embrace the finite amount of life we have on this planet. The definition of what matters through the different stages of life has been a super radical shift. When I was early in my career, I had very singular obsessive goals. 2 that kind of carried me through my entire 20s was becoming the number 1 agent in the world at Keller Williams, and the other one becoming a 30 under 30, according to the National Association of Realtors. And they both happened the exact same year. And it was after like 8 or 9 years of obsessive concentration. And it's interesting because both of them turned out to be an empty and meaningless feeling. The next morning I woke up, nothing felt different. If anything, it was probably my less profitable year because I was obsessed with a vanity metric of units versus net income. And then I kind of felt lost. And it was such a good reminder because I've been able to channel that feeling as I kind of get caught up in moments where I'm worried about a vanity metric. And whether it's starting a company, selling it, having a great year, one of the things that I can tie back to is the sacrifices for those small moments. In the end, if you zoom out 3-5 years later, you can't even remember why you missed that milestone moment, right? There's a friend whose wedding I missed, and I can't remember what it was so important that weekend that I couldn't juggle it and make it. And I'm no longer in that business anymore, but I do have regret for having missed that milestone moment. So I think if you can always tie back to an emotion and realize the concept that in 3 generations and 100 years, no one will have ever remembered you were here. And so the concept of the only thing that's real is the relationships we have with our loved ones in that moment is how I center myself and try to prioritize. The moment that changed my perspective was the financial crisis. I went from being very successful, materially speaking, to losing everything in a short period of time. And that included relationships. There were folks who actually treated me differently after that moment. And I had a very, and again, I call it a gift because it happened super early on in my life. And I think I was able to detach from what you would call a superficial acquaintance relationship versus a true, meaningful, deep relationship. And one of the things that came out of it is just, look, first of all, appreciating the acquaintances and the non-deep relationships for what they are, which can be moments in time, transactional, however you want to frame them, but identifying and comparing them to a deep relationship, whether it's a loved family member, loved one, or a friend, and just being able to distinguish the differences and also understanding that friendships comes with seasons where there could be somebody very close to you in your life who then drift away because you either outgrow them or they outgrow you, or you guys just take different paths, and both of them are okay, and just kind of recognizing and honor that relationship in that moment in time. But going back to what is actually meaningful and real, a really good example of that for me in this season of life, my kids are still very young, and I have a rule where I don't go to dinner unless it's a close friend, right? So if someone comes to visit for work especially, they say, let's go to dinner, there's a 100% answer is no, right? I will have breakfast and I will have lunch. And again, I value interpersonal relationships, so I'm not saying it's an all or none thing. But dinners that are away from my kids are very few and far between. They're normally strictly social for friends on a weekend when the kids are spending time with their grandparents, which they love to do. But in a younger phase of my journey, I would have had dinner 2 or 3 or 4 times a week because it was very effective, great way to rapport build, close deals. But at the phase I'm in right now, when I look at the finite amount of time I have with my kids at the age they're at, those are non-negotiables for me. I think the conversation of balance is fascinating because I do believe there's seasons to everything. When you are in your 20s, your superpower is energy. You literally have boundless amounts of energy where you can work 10, 12 hours a day for a very long sustained period of time compared to someone in their 40s. And I do think that the time value ROI that comes from that is impossible to replace. I was able to compress my 20s into probably 2 decades of actual hours just by working more than most people. When you have a life partner and you have little people who rely on you, I feel like that's a non-negotiable because the trade-off is that they won't know you and the relationship won't be nearly as close. So I think your journey is unique as an individual, and I have friends who've had kids super early on in life, and there was drastic payoffs to get to the stability and goals they had. But I think, one of the most important things you can do as a human being is have a deep understanding of who you are and what strengths and weaknesses you have in your current position and station in life. But I do believe that once you fully grasp your point in your journey, it can become a superpower. So if you're young and you have boundless amounts of energy and lack of responsibility, working 10, 12, 14 hours a day is something that's possible for a period of time. If you are happily married with children, I don't suggest it because I think it'll atrophy and break things that are irreparable. And again, if you are an empty nester and you again have more time, and that is something you want to do for another season of life, that is 100% a choice. But I think that the concept of balance, I heard once explained as it's an illusion, right? If you look at a very good example of what balance is picture a ballerina on her tippy toes. And from a distance, it looks like perfect balance. But when you zoom in on the feet, it's actually rapid counterbalance at a very fast pace that creates the illusion of balance. So, if you think of balance as a flat line, every example of death is flatlining, right? Life is an upward trajectory, a downward trajectory, and sometimes it's up, sometimes it's down, but it's never static, because the best analogy is that once you've hit stasis, you're no longer here. I think one of the ways to center yourself is to try to live in the moment, which I think is an oversaid cliche. But I think where most people get lost is living in the future, right? Building or striving for something that's not here yet, or living in the past that's rehashing past events, normally coupled with regret. So the centering exercise is to say, how can you be present in the moment? And the tactical deployment of that to me would be leave your phone or your watch or your computer in another room where you can't actually be physically distracted. We live in a world where everyone's competing for attention. And in the role I have currently, I've had to learn to be completely okay with the chaos. There's always going to be another emergency. There's always going to be something that needs to be done. And if you can't be present in that moment, it is impossible to be ever present in that moment. So you have to build systems and processes that allow you to be present with the people you're in front of. A good example of what I've been talking about with prioritization is if you look at EXP's entire calendar, it's actually predicated on the Riviera Day School in Miami, right? Before we schedule any large event, any retreats, any national conferences, I actually put into my schedule all of the meaningful milestone events for the kids and my family as well. So if we're planning a vacation, we try to plan out as far as possible. Understand the cadence of your life, right? If you are leaving everything to the last minute, there will be things that aren't taken care of in a timely manner. And so the more you can plan ahead, the more control you have over your schedule, because whether it's that last phone call or the last appointment or that last minute opportunity that pops up, if you don't radically control what's most important, nothing's ever important. And then you're living in a firefighter situation.